In this week's video, I want to talk to you about a recent event that could potentially have a huge impact on the housing market and how house prices perform over the next year or two. Now, I'm not referring to the wonderful government scheme to offer 99% mortgages. My very succinct feelings on that scheme is that it is unlikely to ever see the light of day. The Tories are offering this as a vote winner, and it seems extremely unlikely that they are going to win the next election. So it's very unlikely that policy is ever going to come to fruition. Now, I'm not saying that maybe Labour or another party won't come up with an alternative scheme that could have an impact on the housing market. And if that ever does happen, rest assured I will be making videos to explain the potential impact of those schemes as and when they are announced. But what I want to talk about today is something that has happened to me in the past week, and it has seriously opened my eyes to something that I thought was very different over the past year. But let me explain as we go through the video. And there's also something coming in April that combined with what's happened to me over the past week, potentially does change my outlook for the housing market, or at least part of the housing market over the next year or two. So just firstly, I just want to very quickly recap my position so that anyone that's new to the channel can understand the process that I'm going through at the moment and why I may have done what I've done over the past week. So we sold our family house, what turned out to be the peak, around about August, September 2022. And at that time, we were supposed to be buying another property. But within the last week or two of the transaction, it became clear that that property just wasn't going to be viable. And I've got a video on the channel that covers that in a lot more detail. But the long story short is that we decided not to buy that property. And instead of trying to find another property, the state of the housing market at that time was one of the factors that we took into consideration when we decided we're going to proceed with our sale and move into a rental property. So that's what we did. We sold at the peak, and we've been in the rental ever since. And we're sitting on the sidelines, potentially waiting to buy either for ourselves or, as we quite like where we are, we may stay where we are and buy investment properties instead. We haven't decided yet. We're just continuing to watch the market and assessing it as we go. So that's my position. Now, last year, we viewed one property in the entire year because I felt that pretty much all of the properties that were being listed did not reflect what was happening in the housing market. But as we got towards the end of 2023, we did start to see a kind of a smattering of listings that did offer value. You know, the sort of property that if you could get at the price it was at, it felt like it was decent value, but also offered you some downside protection so that if the housing market continued down, it wouldn't be a major issue. So that's where we were. Now, as it's January, the housing market activity has supposedly picked up, but really, when you look on Rightmove, other than an influx of listing on Boxing Day, it's still very, very slow, and listings are still well down from where they were a few months ago. But over the past week or two, we have viewed two different properties. One was a slightly cheaper property, and then one was a much more expensive property. So we viewed the cheaper property first. We thought it was very interesting, potentially had long-term potential to develop it into what we wanted it to be. It wasn't what we wanted to start with. So I thought, you know what, let's reach out to the bank. Let's just see what they will lend me. And this is kind of the main takeaway from this video. This is the thing that shocked me the most. Now, my position, I am self-employed. I've got my own limited company, and it's the same for my wife as well. She's got a limited company. Now, historically, ever since the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, banks, they haven't liked lending to us that are self-employed, and they make us jump through a lot more hoops. For example, if we want to get lending from a bank, we normally have to provide 2 years worth of accounts, whereas someone that just wants to, someone that's employed, maybe can get away with 3 to 6 months of pay slips. So I've had these weird situations in the past where when I've started a new business, I can't get a mortgage from a bank because I don't have 2 years of accounts, but some of the people that I employed at the time that I gave 3 months pay slips to, they could go and get a mortgage. So it's a very, very strange situation. But the key thing you need to know is that banks don't really like lending to people that are self-employed. But I wanted to know how much they'd lend me regardless to see how much buffer we'd have to develop that property as we'd like to do. So they asked me how much I'd want, and I said, right, I want X amount. Thought that should be well within the reasonable request. And sure enough, they come back and say, yeah, we can give you that. It's absolutely fine. And then I said to them, just out of interest, what's the maximum you'll lend me? And the guy said, well, technically, we don't really tender you the maximum. You have to ask for an amount, and then we either approve it or disapprove it. And then I spoke to him for a little bit longer, and then he just told me straight out. He told me how much I could borrow. And I was shocked because I've made videos on this over the past year, how affordability should impact the amount of money that people can borrow. But they offered me more last week than what they offered me at the peak 2 years ago. And actually at the peak 2 years ago, I I was actually earning a bit more than I am now because I was doing a bit more work, whereas now I don't really push as hard, so I'm not actually earning as much. So I said to him, how come you're offering me that much? And he said, well, our standard multiplier is 4.75% joint income, which in this market, I was shocked because even a year or two ago, getting 4 or 4.5 was kind of the norm. And when you consider the inflation that we've seen and you consider the interest rates have gone up so much, the fact they're now offering 4.75 affordability, and this is for people that are self-employed, and this is from a big provider as well. This was from First Direct, and the reason I called them, they were market leading last week at 3.99%, I think they were. There were some that were slightly cheaper, but they had like £1,000 or £1,500 upfront fee, whereas First Direct was only $4.99. So that's for me why they were the market leading provider. So that has now made me rethink a little bit about where the housing market could go, because I've always assumed that affordability for most people is going to be crushed, but it still seems that the banks are very, very keen to lend a very large amount of money. And this, I actually went through an affordability check for this as well. So I spent 90 minutes on the phone, which is absolutely ridiculous. But the actual affordability side of things took about 30 minutes. So they took in all of my accounts for the past 2 years, my wife's accounts for the past 2 years, all of her outgoings and all of that. So they've already looked at the affordability side of things. And they basically said, look, as long as your accounts back up what we're telling you and the survey passes, then you'll get the mortgage. So this was a full affordability checked agreement in principle. Just a quick rant on that. Can we just pick a simple name for this? We have different mortgage providers. It's either an agreement in principle, a decision in principle, a mortgage in principle. It's an AIP, it's a DIP, it's an MIP. I mean, just pick one and surely just call it an AIP or just any one of them. But all three of them just confuses it for people, especially people that are new to the market. So they've given me this huge AIP now, which means I can go and buy a house at a much greater value than I thought I could. And that's kind of why I then viewed a second more expensive property last week, which is more towards the higher end of the budget, as typically you do when you're buying a house, as it is usually the most important purchase in your life. You stretch your budget. And even for me, someone that is fully aware of the state of the housing market at the moment and that is in such a precarious position and that things could easily head south very quickly from here, even I am tempted to buy at the moment. So if I'm in this position with my knowledge and I'm thinking this, what is your average person that isn't following the housing market as closely as us and the people watching this video, and people that fully trust the house price indices, which don't actually paint too bad a picture of what's happening in the UK at the moment? What sort of decisions do we think they're going to take? Are they really going to sit there being offered a big mortgage and go, do you know what? Actually, I'm going to sit tight and wait for a crash, as I think that's going to happen, when all of the HPIs are showing that a crash isn't happening. And I know, obviously, we've talked about in previous videos that we don't fully trust the HPIs. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But I just wanted to share that initial event with you and how this can now combine with something else that's coming in April to potentially have a big impact on especially the lower end of the housing market. So keep in mind, banks are super eager to lend at the moment, and that's why they're slashing rates. That's why they're offering crazy multipliers still, despite the risk that is clearly there to both the economy and the UK housing market. So that's the background you need to keep in mind. And then going forward, as of April, we get the new minimum wage. And the new minimum wage is £11.44 per hour. Now, this isn't a criticism of the minimum wage or people on the minimum wage. What this is a recognition of the potential impact this could have on the housing market when you combine it with basically these relaxed lending policies that we're seeing at the moment. So if you take two people, because pretty much no one's buying a house on their own at the moment, are they? If you're going to buy a house, it's going to have to be with your partner. So two people that are on £11.44 per hour, if they work full time, say they're on a 40-hour week, that's about, I think it's 22 or is it 24? I'm going to have to double check the math. Let's just say 24,000 per year if they're doing a 40-hour week on minimum wage. So between them, that's 48,000. Now, if you pop that into a calculator, let me just bring one up. I don't know if you guys can actually see this. No, it's not going to show you at the moment. I'm just going to run the calculations here. So it's so 48,000 times by 4.75, £228,000. Now, the average deposit for first-time buyers, it varies depending on who you believe, but it's anywhere, it can be around about 25%, which is often coming from the bank of mum and dad, which would take you pretty much to the average house price in the UK, which is around 280,000. So when you take those two things into account, that the minimum wage is going up in April, and that the banks or the mortgage providers are still lending freely, is the downside of the lower end of the market limited? Because that lower end of the market, you've got the first-time buyers wanting to buy, you've got the buy-to-let landlords that are investing, the ones that are cash buyers and not relying on credit, and then you've also got the downsizers as well, the people that are selling the big properties. So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of demand at the lower end of the market. And we've spoken over the past couple of months about how the house price indices don't seem to be reflecting what we're seeing happening in the housing market. And I think this potentially could explain it. And we're not going to know this for certain unless one of the HPIs actually shows us their full breakdown of calculations and how they weight different property prices. But I think potentially what is happening is that historically, there's always been more transactions at the lower end of the market. It makes sense. Houses that go for 200, 300, 400,000 pound, they're going to sell a lot more frequently than places that sell for £1 million. And if the indices have been developed in that environment over the past decade or two, there's been more transactions at the lower end of the market, then their indices should be weighted towards the lower end because that is where the majority of transactions are. If they just did a fixed number from each tier of the market, it wouldn't truly reflect what's happening with house prices. So these indices are potentially weighted towards the lower end of the market. And if what we're seeing over the past year or two is that those lower value properties are still continuing to transact, but because of buy-to-let demand, because of first-time buyer demand, because of downsizing demand, that part of the market hasn't really fallen that much, but the top end of the market, which is more reliant on expensive mortgages, has come down substantially. It's not being truly reflected as the indices are still weighted towards the lower transactions, which are actually holding their value. So that is one theory. It's not fact. It's just something I'm thinking about at the moment based on this new information. So I just wanted to share it with you guys so you can make your own decisions, as ultimately we're all making our best guess in this market as to which way things are going to go. You guys clearly know where I think house prices are heading, but certainly what's happened over the past week or so has made me reconsider maybe how we are going to get there and which properties are going to be impacted the most. Now, if you want to see why I think inflation is about to make a shock return, I'm going to pop up a video now and I'll see you guys over there.